This is lecture number 5, A Case of Settler Colonialism, Part 1. There are a number of complex relationships we need to discuss, which are how the new Yishuv consolidated as a new society in Palestine, which means understanding the different aspects of this process in terms of Jewish immigration, labor and the economy of this new Yishuv, housing, culture, and institutions. We need also to understand how the native Arab Palestinian reacted to this development. Or to put it in other words, we need to discuss the emergence of Arab Palestinian resistance to Zionism. The third set of relationship is in regard the Ashkenazi Sephardi relations in Palestine. Remember that the old issue was mainly comprised by Sephardi and Mizrahi Jewish groups, whereas the new issue, the issue that was being founded by the European Ashkenazi Zionists, was different and asked to consolidate a new kind of society. So these three sets of relationships, how the new issue developed, what was the reaction of the Arab Palestinians, and how the Ashkenazi Sephardi relations unfolded. This is something we need to understand and keep in mind that these relationships are all connected. The complexity of these relationships is and indeed there is a question why we are characterizing the case of Zionism in Palestine as a case of settler colonialism. In order to understand this, I would like first to frame the discussion by distinguishing between two types of colonialism. All forms of colonialism have always begun with some sort of invasion into a foreign territory, foreign from the viewpoint of the invader. In classical colonialism, invasion have generally took place through the use of military superiority and the occupation of a territory fully or partially. The goal of classical colonialism has always been to exploit both natural resources and indigenous labor. Another important characteristic of classical colonialism is that the colonizer is not interested in developing a permanent form of life for themselves, but to hold in the colony officials, administrators, military personnel and their families in order to run the colony and enable the exploitation of resources and labor. Historically, also settler colonialism begins with some form of invasion. However, there are differences between the cases. We know that in Australia, the British invaded the continent by the use of military force. In Palestine, Zionism did not have that superiority, and we will see that what we call so far Zionist immigration turned into a form of invasion. Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism that functions through the replacement of indigenous population with an invasive settler society that, over time, develops a distinctive identity and sovereignty. Settler colonial states include Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, but also many other places such as Israel, Kenya, Argentina, Chile, and more. The goal of settler colonialism is not to extract resources and exploit native labor, though those processes might take place as well. But the main goal of a settler colonial process is to create a new society and a new political order that comes to replace the system of life of native population. So, the logic of settler colonialism is one of displacement, replacement of indigenous people. Different settler colonial cases have used different methods, means, in order to achieve the goal of displacement, replacement, ranging from genocide or expulsion or ethnic cleansing through forms of segregation. There are two main patterns that we need to remember in regards of how settler colonialism works. The first is that settlers come to stay. They do not come to exploit and live, but to stay and replace the native populations. And that is why they invest in eliminating native systems of life. The second pattern is that settler colonialism is not a one-time event, but rather a process, a structure that continues. Therefore, the key distinction between classical colonialism and settler colonialism is that whereas classical colonialism is organized and is practiced around a logic of exploitation, settler colonialism, on the other hand, is characterized by a logic of elimination. Again, elimination of native forms of life. Settler colonial societies around the globe tend to rely on remarkably similar spatial constructs, power structures, and social narratives. Beginning with terra nullius, the perception that the land was not being properly used or was empty of any form of life, is very common to a number of settler colonial histories. Also, the development of new forms of identity of the settler society that are attached to the land that has been captured from indigenous peoples. Narrative of dehumanization of indigenous peoples, portraying them as savage and underdeveloped, that go together with self-celebratory narrative of settlerism based on the idea of the white pioneers, the adventurous men, the civilizatory mission of these processes, and so forth. Another common pattern to all forms of settler colonialism, but also to classical colonialism, is the construct of race. In the reading by Patrick Wolf, Traces of History, you will find a discussion of how race as an ideology and a doctrine has been incorporated in colonial processes. The point here is that race have helped European societies to differentiate between human collectivities. However, this differentiation that race introduced is not natural, but hierarchical, and it depends on a perception of the other as defective, as varying from the standard that is always given by the white European society. So race is not something that the other, in this case the indigenous people, can negotiate or discuss, but from the European point of view is a sort of destiny, something that the other, the indigenous people, embody. Racialization is the practice of race. Racialization is about how the imperial society or the settler colonial society use the perceptions of race to dominate the indigenous populations. So, when we think about what the colonizer brings with them in invasion, we should think not only of their advantages in terms of military power or capital or perhaps some technological advantage, but also we need to think of the cultural traits, the social patterns that they bring with them and they ask to implement in the territory that they conquer. Here it's important to understand that colonizers have always come to the new territories with the idea of race and with the intention of racializing those conquered populations. Patrick Wolf calls these ranges of attributes and advantages as pre-accumulation or colonial pre-accumulation. Now, when we think of the Zionist invasion through immigration into Palestine, we need to remember that the Jewish European populations suffer for centuries anti-Semitism and racism. Sadly, when they came into Palestine, they brought with them the same racial logics that they were victims of, and they implemented these constructs of race towards the native Arab population of Palestine, both towards the Arab Muslim and Christian, and also towards the Arab Jewish population, that is, towards the Sephardim and the Mizrahi Jews of Palestine. Zionism, we will see, implemented two axes of race. One was to racialize everything as Arab, as inferior. And also, Zionism attempted and still attempts to deracinate Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, which means to de-Arabize the Oriental Jew in order to make them European. Zionism as a form of settler colonialism has particular characteristics. It is still early in this point to make the claims I am about to make, but we are presenting these 5 points now in order to help you framing what follows. So the idea is that I'm asking you to try and identify these 5 main patterns of Zionism in what follows. So, as a settler colonial project, first of all, Zionist invasion did not take the form of a classical maritime or military invasion, but it proceeded through slow immigration and capture of land. We will need to see more in detail how immigration and capture of land function. So far, what we did is to try and understand the characteristics of the first aliyah. But now we need to see what happened from the first aliyah into the second aliyah and what changed in the sense of the private capture of land. The second point is that Zionism was not a traditional settler colonial project in the sense of it never sought for new lands and wealth to exploit, but Zionism was driven by an impetus to create a solution to anti-Semitism in Europe. The third point is that, in contrast to most settler colonial histories around the globe, the sort of indigenous society that the Zionist immigrant settlers found was already part of what could be called the modern world. Palestine was a nascent semi-capitalist society with a developing land market, and though most of its population lived in rural areas, it had a number of towns and cities. The fourth point is that the Zionist settlers were never interested in exploiting native cheap labor. We will see that their main preoccupation was to find labor for the Jewish immigrants. And the last point is that Zionism as a settler colonial project never had an interest in imposing its culture onto the natives, but in fact it was interested in creating an alternative society to replace the native population of Palestine and its forms of life. Once we have discussed the difference between classical colonialism and settler colonialism, and once we have mentioned the main characteristics of Zionism as a settler colonial project, we need now to prove those points. We need now to show the stories that explain those particularities. So we are going to focus the story on the process of transformation of the new Yishuv in Palestine from the first Aliyah into the second Aliyah, the first wave of Jewish immigration into the second wave of Jewish immigration. One of the main issues in these stories is the capture of land, the capture of native land, of Palestinian land. We will need to understand how Zionism changed its way and adapted in order to capture land that could be used to cement a new settler society. And we need also to understand what happens with native forms of life on captured land. The period of time that we will cover in this lecture goes from early 20th century and more or less up to World War I. Let me remind you the achievements of the Zionist organization by early 20th century. If you remember, Theodor Herzl convened the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, which was de facto the official launching of the Zionist movement and the foundation of the Zionist organization. The goal was to create an asylum for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And Herzl was interested in achieving international recognition. A year later, the Second Zionist Congress convened. At this time, it added the imperative to colonize Palestine in order to achieve the Zionist goal of creating an asylum for the Jewish people. Many practical measures were agreed upon during the congresses. Already in the Second Zionist Congress, the Jewish Colonial Trust was founded. This was in fact a bank. This bank opened a number of branches in Palestine under the name of the Anglo-Palestine Bank. This bank was not established with the aim to make profit as its only goal. This bank, the Anglo-Palestine Bank, its main goal was to finance the Zionist project, which means to help Jewish immigrants to buy land, to help them settling, to help them obtaining concessions in order to develop economic enterprises, and so on and so forth. So as you can see, the Zionist congresses were not mere congregations for debate, but they were frameworks that at the same time created executive means and institutions to further the Zionist goal of colonization. To make it even clearer, if we quote from the JCT objectives, it reads, to promote, develop, work, and carry on industries, undertakings, and colonization schemes, migration from or immigration into any country or countries, and in particularly of persons of the Jewish race into Palestine, Syria, and other countries in the East, to carry on the business of banking so far as consider expedient, incidentally to any other business of the company, to acquire from any state or other authority in any part of the world any concessions, grants, decrees, rights, and privileges whatsoever, to seek and obtain openings for the employment of capital in Palestine, Syria, and in any part of the world, and with the view thereto to prospect, examine, explore, test, and develop any mining, landed, agriculture, and other properties, and to dispatch and employ expedition, agents, and others. Though we see that the goals, as it's stated in the statutes of the JCT, talk not only about Palestine, this was meant to focus on settlement in Palestine. During the first 20 years of the Zionist project in Palestine, the most important institutions were established. I will go now through the main Zionist institutions that play a very important role in developing the settled colonial project in Palestine. The first is the Jewish National Fund, the JNF. It was founded in 1901 at the Fifth Zionist Congress, and its general aim was, and still is, to buy and develop land in Palestine for Jewish settlement. The JNF exists still, and today it owns about 13% of the land in the State of Israel. The most important point about the JNF is its charter and the regulation that were established in regards to the land that is purchased by the JNF. According to the JNF Charter, land that is purchased by the JNF cannot be resold to anyone. It is held in trust for the whole Jewish nation, and it cannot be leased, that is, rented, to non-Jews. This means that land purchased by the JNF, only Jewish persons can use it to establish a settlement or to do agricultural work or for other goal. But as you see, the JNF Charter rationalized the land that was purchased by the institution. The goal was to save every tract of land that is bought by the JNF only for Jewish immigrants into Palestine. Another important institution was the Palestine Office, which was established in 1908 and opened in the city of Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast. In fact, the Palestine Office was the executive branch of the Zionist organization in Palestine, a sort of central agency, or even if you like, a form of quasi-government to run and manage all Zionist activities related to settlement, including the purchase of land, immigration, and other social and cultural institutions. The first head of the Palestine Office was Arthur Ruppin. We will come back to Ruppin's role in the early stages of Zionism. The Palestine Office changed its name and framework in 1918, after World War I, into what was called the Zionist Commission, that was led by the person who succeeded Theodor Herzl as the main international leader of the Zionist organization, Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann will become the first president of the State of Israel in 1948. So, the Palestine Office, as I said, established in 1908, changed its name and form to the Zionist Commission in 1918, and again in 1929 it became the Jewish Agency, which was already a sort of government for the issue. In 1948, when the State of Israel is established, the Jewish Agency will become de facto the first government of the State of Israel. The JNF was not alone as an organization that helped buying land and settling Jews in Palestine. Earlier, in 1891, the Baron Maurice de Hirsch founded the Jewish Colonization Association that helped Eastern European Jews to leave Russia and Eastern Europe and to emigrate and build agricultural settlements even in South America. But the JCA also helped Jewish immigrants in Palestine. In 1924, the JCA turned into the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, or PICA. And there was also the Palestine Land Development Company, established in 1908, which had similar goals and aims as the JCA and the JNF. As you see, all these institutions were part in the puzzle of helping Jewish immigration and helping Jewish settlement in Palestine. These attest for a high level of organization on the part of the Zionist organization and determination to further the Zionist project. Obviously, all these institutions had to work very hard in fundraising the necessary money in order to help the Jewish immigrants getting into Palestine and settling on the land. So far, I have characterized the Zionist project in Palestine as a settler colonial project. And we have seen as well that the Zionist organization created institutions to help the Jewish European immigrants coming into Palestine to settle. But we don't know yet how exactly the capture of land by these institutions work. In the next few slides, we are going to look into two programs or policies that help shaping the way forward. So then, how to colonize? How all those institutions that we commented about just now came together into a plan of colonization to settle the Jewish immigrants coming from Eastern Europe. The first thing we need to say is that there was no agreed plan of colonization that was followed. In fact, there were a series of experimentations on the ground that led eventually to different stages in the colonization plan in Palestine. The two first important plans of action, those that aim at identifying what will be the best conditions for settlement in Palestine, belong to two leaders. One, Menachem Usishkin, in his pamphlet Our Program, published in 1904, which discuss what will be the best method to acquire land. And the second plan is Arthur Rupin's memorandum from 1907 that discussed how to create a new settlement based on acquired land. Now, it is important to say that these two plans, Usishkin's Our Program and Rupin's Memorandum, were not ideological proclamations, were not propaganda, but in fact very much down-to-earth blueprints that were tried and eventually followed. Menachem Usishkin was one of the most prominent Zionist leaders coming from Russia. From the very first moment of the development of the Zionist movement, he was involved with the Bilu groups and with Hovevei Tzion. He was very active at the Zionist congresses, and eventually in 1923 was elected to be the president of the Jewish National Fund. In his pamphlet, Our Program, Menachem Usishkin commented on the significance of the land market for Jewish colonization. Now, note that we are talking about 1904, the threshold between the first and the second Aliyah. In that pamphlet, Usishkin said, in order to establish autonomous Jewish community life, or to be more precise, a Jewish state in Eretz Israel, land of Israel, or Palestine, It is necessary, first of all, that all, or at least most, of Eretz Israel's lands will be property of the Jewish people. Without ownership of the land, Eretz Israel will never become Jewish. Be the number of Jews whatever it may be in the towns and even in the villages. And Jews will remain in the very same abnormal situation which characterizes them in the diaspora. They will be without recognized status. But as the ways of the world go, how does one acquire landed property? By one of the following three methods. By force, that is, by conquest in war, or in other words, by robbing land of its owner. By forceful acquisition, that is, by expropriation via governmental authority, and by purchase with the owner's consent. Obviously, the Jewish immigrants in Palestine at that point in time and the Zionist organization were not able to go for the first nor the second method. They didn't have the military might to conquer land in Palestine. Neither they were government or could persuade the Ottoman government to be granted the land. So the only way the Zionist organization could acquire land, could own land, as Osishkin suggested, was just by purchasing land in the open market. And this is why, from the very first beginning of the Zionist movement in Palestine, from the first Aliyah, and all the way into 1948, when the State of Israel was eventually established, in all those about 50 years, the Zionist organization tried to acquire land by purchasing from their owners. Only in 1948, and we will see this in a couple of weeks, when the Yishuv, now the State of Israel, was strong enough also militarily, it didn't recur anymore to purchasing land, but it used its military might to keep conquering land by sword. Arthur Rupin was an economist and he specialized in statistics. In 1905, he joined the Zionist organization, and 2 years later, based on his experience in statistics and involvement with the Zionist movement, he was sent to Palestine to study the conditions of the Yishuv to develop settlement, agriculture, and industry. In that year, he sent his recommendations to the Jewish National Fund. A year later, Rupin came to live in Palestine to lead the Palestine office, which was to become the executive branch of the Zionist organization. The office was open in Jaffa, and its aim was to manage and organize settlement activities for the Jewish immigrants coming from Eastern Europe. Arthur Rupin was fundamental in shaping the direction of settlement, particularly during the Second Aliyah. In the memorandum itself that is sent to the Jewish National Fund, he said, "I see it as absolutely necessary to limit for the time being the territorial aim of Zionism. We should strive to attain autonomy, not in the whole of Eretz Israel, but only in certain districts. And then he continued to explain how to join together different parts in Palestine to make one contiguous settlement. So Rupin recognized that the Zionist movement is not able at that point in time to wholly conquer or acquire somehow all the land in Palestine for colonization purposes. So that is why he believed that the Zionist movement should focus on particular tracts of land. Where exactly to buy land and why Rupin choose those places mentioned in the paragraph in the previous slide. Rupin identified the relative sparseness of the Palestinian population in the coastal zone and in the inland valleys. So he believed that if the Zionist movement will be buying tracts of land in those areas to make Jewish settlement, these places can be joined together incrementally to create one contiguous strip of Jewish settlement. In this map, you can see the black spots which represent the tracts of land that Rupin recommended to purchase. Again, according to those names that I read from the paragraph 2 slides ago, and that eventually the Zionist organization did purchase from Arab owners. Those places on the coast and in the inland valleys, and up north through the Lake of Tiberias, create a sort of N shape that Rupin talked about. This N shape of Jewish colonization created a sort of autonomous life for the new immigrants. So they managed to create during the years a contiguous settlement from Jaffa up north to Haifa and Acre, and then down into inland valleys, and again up north through the Sea of Galilee of the Tiberias Lake. This is the N shape that Rupin recommended for settlement and that eventually was created. From the first to the second Aliyah, the Zionist organization and the leadership in Palestine had already figured out a method of colonization. So the first principle was that tracts of land need to be purchased. 3/4 of the land that was purchased in this period of time was bought from absentee landowners. These were Arab rich people who didn't live in Palestine, but in big cities in the Ottoman Empire and owned large tracts of land in Palestine. The second principle that given by Rupin was that the tracts of land to be purchased need to create territorial contiguity in order, obviously, to create a sense of continuous community in Palestine. And when you put these two first principles together, what you create is the third principle, which is to increase the demographic ratio of Jews on land purchase. We need to pay attention that most of the land was purchased by the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. If you remember, the JNF code said that land purchased by the JNF cannot be resold and can be leased only to Jews. This meant that all the tracts of land bought by the JNF to become part of the N shape that Rupin conceived, all those tracts of lands were made into national land, Jewish national land, to serve the Zionist project. Once you buy that land, you cannot sell it back, which means that slowly the JNF extracted land from the open market in Palestine, land that was aimed to become part of the Jewish settlement. Who lived on that land? In about 10% of the land that the JNF bought, fellahin tenants lived and worked. Once these tracts of land were bought by the JNF, these fellahin families were expelled and dispossessed from their source of income. These two maps show you the development of Jewish settlement and where Zionist colonies were established. From 1920 to 1944, you clearly can see the growth on the numbers of Jewish colonies and the N shape that Arthur Rupin suggested and recommended to the Zionist organization. I would like to end this lecture by stressing a number of topics that we addressed today. The first is that we learn about the differences between classical colonialism and settler colonialism. Another important issue that we address is that we started to identify the particularities of the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine. Another important issue is that we started to learn about the main Zionist colonial institutions that held in the project of settler colonizing Palestine. And we also started to learn about how these institutions and the settlers themselves on the ground began purchasing land as a stage towards colonizing the country.